The night is quiet, the world asleep. So pour yourself some coffee, settle in, and let the mystery begin. You're watching Sherlock Tales. Subscribe now and step deeper into the shadows with every story. The November fog of 1895 had descended upon London with its customary malevolence, transforming the grand thoroughfares of Mayfair into a labyrinth of muffled sounds and ghostly silhouettes. Gas lamps flickered like dying stars through the grey shroud, casting wavering pools of amber light that seemed to emphasize, rather than dispel, the gathering darkness. It was on such an evening that the musical salons of the wealthy found their greatest purpose, drawing London's cultural elite into warm, gaslit sanctuaries where art might triumph over the dreary English climate. Sir Reginald Blackwood's mansion in Grosvenor Square stood as a testament to both wealth and refined taste. The distinguished gentleman, a patron of the arts whose fortune derived from extensive railway investments, had long made his home a gathering place for London's most celebrated musicians. His wife, Lady Catherine, possessed that rare combination of social grace and genuine musical appreciation that made their soirees the most coveted invitations in artistic circles. On this particular evening, the cream of London society had assembled in the Blackwoods' magnificent music room for what promised to be an extraordinary performance. The centerpiece of the evening was to be a recital by Maestro Lucien Armitage, the enigmatic pianist whom the press had dubbed the Phantom of the Keys, for his habit of performing in dimly lit rooms and his tendency to vanish from public view between performances. Armitage, a man of perhaps 35 years, possessed an otherworldly pale complexion and fingers that seemed to possess an almost supernatural dexterity. His performances were legendary, not merely for their technical brilliance, but for the haunting, almost spectral quality he brought to even the most familiar compositions. Among the distinguished guests that evening were several individuals whose presence would prove significant in the tragedy that was to unfold. Miss Vivian Ashford, a talented young pianist in her own right, sat in the front row, her dark eyes fixed upon Armitage with an intensity that spoke of professional admiration mixed with something deeper. She had been studying under the maestro's tutelage for the past 6 months, and whispers in musical circles suggested that their relationship extended beyond the purely pedagogical. Dr. Marcus Pemberton, a collector of rare musical instruments and a respected musicologist, occupied a chair near the magnificent Steinway grand piano that dominated the room. His scholarly interest in musical history had made him a frequent guest at such gatherings, though his pale, somewhat nervous disposition suggested a man more comfortable with ancient manuscripts than social intercourse. Mr. Edmund Kestrel, Armitage's manager and business representative, hovered near the back of the room with the practiced invisibility of one whose livelihood depended upon his ability to facilitate his client's artistic endeavors without drawing attention to himself. His sharp features and calculating eyes missed nothing, constantly assessing the audience's mood and his performer's condition with the vigilance of a theatrical impresario. The evening had progressed through its customary phases: light refreshments, social conversation, and the gradual settling of the audience into their seats as the appointed hour approached. Armitage, dressed in his characteristic black evening wear, had taken his place at the piano with that peculiar combination of confidence and detachment that marked all his public appearances. The gas lamps had been dimmed according to his preference, leaving only a few flickering flames to illuminate the keyboard and cast dancing shadows across the assembled faces. The program began with a Chopin nocturne, performed with such delicate precision that the audience seemed to hold its collective breath. This was followed by a Liszt etude that showcased Armitage's remarkable technical abilities, his fingers flying across the keys with a speed and accuracy that bordered on the supernatural. As the evening progressed, the maestro seemed to grow more animated, his usually pale complexion taking on a feverish flush as he lost himself in the music. It was nearly 11 o'clock when Armitage announced his final piece of the evening. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said in his soft, cultured voice that carried despite its quietness. "I shall conclude tonight's performance with a composition of my own creation, a piece I have titled Midnight's Embrace. I must ask for absolute silence during this performance, as it requires my complete concentration." The audience settled into expectant quiet as Armitage positioned himself at the keyboard. What followed was perhaps the most haunting piece of music any present had ever heard, a complex, melancholy composition that seemed to speak of loss, longing, and ultimate resignation. The melody wove through minor keys with an almost hypnotic quality, building to crescendos that left the listeners emotionally drained before subsiding into whispered pianissimos that barely disturbed the air. It was during the final passage, as the piece approached its conclusion, that the tragedy occurred. Armitage had been playing a particularly complex section, his hands moving across the keyboard with fluid grace, when suddenly his right hand struck a violent discord. The harsh, jangling notes seemed to hang in the air like a cry of anguish. For a moment, the maestro remained upright, his hands frozen above the keys, before he slowly toppled forward, his head striking the keyboard with a final, resonant crash of multiple keys. The audience sat in stunned silence for several heartbeats, uncertain whether this dramatic collapse was part of the performance. It was Miss Ashford who first realized that something was terribly wrong, her sharp intake of breath breaking the spell that held the room. Dr. Pemberton immediately rushed forward, his medical training overriding social protocol. "Stand back, please," he commanded, his voice carrying an authority that his usual demeanor belied. He quickly examined the fallen pianist, checking for pulse and breathing. After a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, he straightened, his face grave. "I'm afraid Maestro Armitage is dead." The pronouncement sent a shock wave through the assembled guests. Lady Catherine uttered a small cry and reached for her husband's arm, while several of the ladies began to murmur prayers or exclamations of disbelief. Sir Reginald, maintaining his composure despite the circumstances, immediately took charge of the situation. "Please, everyone remain calm," he announced. "Dr. Pemberton, what appears to be the cause of death?" The doctor's examination had revealed a small puncture wound just below Armitage's left ear, barely visible but clearly the entry point for some kind of poison or toxic substance. "It appears to be some form of rapid-acting toxin," he reported. "The wound suggests a very fine needle or similar instrument." What made the situation truly baffling, however, was the impossibility of how such an attack could have been carried out. The music room had only one entrance, and Armitage had been in full view of the entire audience throughout his performance. No one had approached the piano, no one had left their seat during the final piece, and yet somehow the maestro had been murdered before their very eyes. As Sir Reginald sent for the police and the guests were asked to remain for questioning, several disturbing details began to emerge. A careful examination of the piano revealed that one of the pedals had been tampered with. A small, spring-loaded mechanism had been concealed within the instrument's framework, though its purpose remained unclear. More puzzling still was the discovery of a single red rose petal on the floor near the piano bench, though no flowers had been present in the room during the performance. Mr. Kestrel, when questioned about his client's recent behavior, revealed that Armitage had been receiving anonymous threatening letters for the past month, messages that warned him to cease his public performances or face dire consequences. The maestro had dismissed these threats as the work of a jealous rival or an unbalanced admirer, but their existence cast a sinister shadow over the evening's events. Miss Ashford, visibly shaken by her mentor's death, provided perhaps the most intriguing piece of information. She revealed that Armitage had recently confided in her about a mysterious patron who had been commissioning private performances, paying extraordinary sums for the privilege of hearing the maestro play in complete isolation. These private concerts had been taking place in various locations around London, always at night, always in perfect secrecy. It was in this atmosphere of confusion and growing dread that Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard arrived at the Blackwood mansion. The veteran detective, experienced though he was in the criminal ways of London, found himself confronted with a puzzle that defied conventional explanation. After examining the scene and interviewing the witnesses, he came to the reluctant conclusion that professional assistance would be required. "This is beyond the usual run of criminal activity," he confided to Sir Reginald. "We're dealing with someone of considerable cunning and technical skill. I believe this matter requires the attention of a consulting detective, someone with experience in cases that venture beyond the ordinary." It was thus that a message was dispatched through the fog-shrouded streets of London to a modest lodging at 221B Baker Street, where the greatest analytical mind of the age sat before his fireplace, perhaps unaware that he was about to encounter one of the most ingenious and diabolical crimes of his distinguished career. The stage was set for a battle of wits between criminal genius and deductive brilliance, with the mystery of the phantom pianist's final note serving as the opening gambit in what promised to be an extraordinary game of intellectual chess. As the fog continued to swirl through the streets of London, concealing secrets and muffling sounds, the great machinery of justice began to turn, drawing inexorably toward a confrontation that would test the limits of human ingenuity and the power of logical deduction. The persistent chiming of our mantel clock had just announced the stroke of midnight when the urgent rap at our door shattered the contemplative silence of our sitting room. Holmes, who had been drawing melancholy strains from his violin while gazing into the dying embers of our fire, lowered his instrument with that peculiar alertness that marked the scent of an intriguing problem. Mrs. Hudson's hurried footsteps preceded her entry, bearing a blue-sealed message upon her silver tray. "Inspector Lestrade, sir," she announced breathlessly. "Says it's most urgent, Mr. Holmes." Holmes broke the seal with deliberate precision, his grey eyes scanning the hastily penned lines with growing interest. "Watson," he said, setting down the note and reaching for his coat, "it appears our evening's tranquility is about to yield to more stimulating pursuits. A death in Grosvenor Square, a pianist murdered during performance before 30 witnesses, yet by no visible hand. Lestrade describes it as impossible, which, as you know, makes it merely improbable awaiting proper analysis." As we descended to the street, Holmes paused at our doorstep, stooping to examine a small fragment of white porcelain embedded in the boot-scraper's iron grating. "Our messenger," he murmured, pocketing the shard, "earns modest wages, lodges near Marylebone Road, and tends coal fires. The clay's distinctive yellow hue, this porcelain fragment from a cracked scuttle handle, and the telltale burn mark on his cuff speak volumes. Accuracy in trifles, Watson. It sharpens the mind for larger deductions." The November fog pressed close about our hansom as we rattled westward through the gaslit streets, transforming familiar thoroughfares into a maze of amber halos and shifting shadows. Holmes sat with his head thrown back, eyes half closed, as if the rhythmic clip-clop of hooves provided a metronome for his racing thoughts. "Consider the theatrical nature of this crime, Watson," he said suddenly. "To commit murder during a musical performance suggests someone with intimate knowledge of both the victim's habits and the venue's acoustics. The killer has transformed art into his stage, a mind of considerable sophistication and dramatic flair. But how could such a crime be accomplished before so many witnesses?" I wondered aloud. "Ah, that is precisely what makes this case fascinating. The very impossibility suggests elaborate preparation and technical ingenuity. We are dealing with someone who understands that the most effective deceptions occur in plain sight, hidden by the very audacity of their execution." The Blackwood mansion emerged from the fog like a great ship riding at anchor, its windows blazing with gaslight despite the late hour. Inspector Lestrade met us at the door, his usually composed demeanor showing clear signs of strain. His relief at our arrival was palpable, though he maintained his professional bearing. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, thank God you've come. I confess this case has me thoroughly bewildered. The victim, Maestro Armitage, collapsed at his piano during the final piece of his recital. Dr. Pemberton, who was among the guests, confirmed death by poisoning, a small puncture wound behind the left ear, yet no one approached the piano, no one left their seat during the performance. Holmes removed his coat with characteristic deliberation, his keen eyes already cataloguing details of the mansion's elegant interior. "The witnesses remain on the premises?" "Yes, sir. I've kept them in the drawing room. The music room is exactly as it was when the crime occurred." "Excellent foresight, Inspector." Holmes turned to survey the entrance hall, noting the arrangement of walking sticks, the fresh white lilies in their crystal vase, and the subtle signs of wealth tempered by genuine artistic appreciation. "Before we examine the scene, tell me, has anyone entered or left the house since the crime?" "Only the constables I summoned and the doctor who confirmed the death. The servants have been questioned and accounted for throughout the evening." Holmes nodded approvingly. "Then let us proceed to the music room. The stage awaits our examination, and I suspect our phantom pianist has left us more clues than he intended. Murder may have been set to music tonight, Watson, but every melody, no matter how complex, follows the inexorable laws of harmony and progression." As we followed Lestrade through the mansion's corridors, I could sense Holmes's mental faculties engaging fully with the puzzle before us. The game, as he would say, was indeed afoot, and I found myself anticipating the methodical brilliance with which he would unravel this most theatrical of crimes. The music room received us with the hushed solemnity of a cathedral, its elegant proportions now transformed into a stage for tragedy. The magnificent Steinway grand piano dominated the space beneath its corona of gaslight, while Maestro Armitage remained slumped across the keyboard in the precise attitude of his final moment. The air carried a faint sweetness beneath the familiar scents of beeswax and velvet, something that made Holmes pause at the threshold, his nostrils flaring slightly as he tested the atmosphere. "Do you detect it, Watson?" he murmured, moving with characteristic deliberation toward the instrument. Beneath the expected fragrances of wealth and refinement, bitter almonds, faint but unmistakable, the calling card of prussic acid, though not dispersed through the air as one might expect in a conventional poisoning. Holmes began his examination not with the victim, but with the periphery of the scene, his keen eyes cataloguing the precise arrangement of chairs that formed a perfect semicircle around the piano. Every guest had enjoyed an unobstructed view of the performance, yet none had witnessed the moment of murder. He knelt beside the piano bench, producing his magnifying glass to study the Persian carpet with minute attention. "Inspector Lestrade mentioned a rose petal," Holmes said, his tweezers extracting the crimson fragment from where it lay against the instrument's base. He held it to the gaslight, examining its edges with scientific precision. "Freshly plucked within the last few hours. Note the clean cut at the stem and the slight bruising along one edge. Crushed underfoot, perhaps. Yet there are no floral arrangements in this room, nor any residual fragrance to suggest recent removal." Setting the petal carefully into an evidence envelope, Holmes turned his attention to the piano itself. His long fingers traced the instrument's elegant lines with the reverence of a craftsman, pausing where the victim's head had struck the keys. Several notes remained depressed from the impact, creating a discordant chord that seemed to mock the evening's intended harmony. "The mechanical device you discovered, Inspector, show me precisely where it was concealed." Lestrade guided us to the left pedal assembly, where Holmes immediately dropped to his knees, disappearing partially beneath the instrument. His voice emerged muffled but animated with discovery. "Ingenious construction, spring-loaded mechanism, recently installed. The brass shows no tarnishing, and there are fresh wood shavings in the housing. Our killer has been planning this crime with considerable foresight." He emerged, holding a compact assemblage of brass and steel, no larger than a gentleman's pocket watch. A fine tube, scarcely thicker than a quill pen, protruded from the mechanism, its mouth bearing traces of a dark, gummy residue. Observe the precision of the workmanship, Watson. This device was crafted by someone with intimate knowledge of both mechanical principles and the piano's internal structure. But how does it function? I asked, examining the curious contraption. Elementary mechanics wedded to diabolical purpose, Holmes replied, demonstrating the device's operation with careful precision. When the sustaining pedal is depressed to its full extent, as any accomplished pianist would do during an emotional climax, the spring releases, propelling a hollow needle through this aperture in the piano's frame. The trajectory aligns perfectly with where the performer's head would be positioned during intense concentration. Holmes then examined the victim himself with clinical detachment. Maestro Armitage presented a figure both elegant and tragic, his pale features retaining their aristocratic refinement even in death. The puncture wound behind his left ear was indeed barely visible, requiring careful examination to detect. The angle of penetration confirms our mechanical theory, Holmes observed. Delivered from above and slightly behind, precisely as our device would accomplish. The poison, undoubtedly prussic acid or a related compound, would have acted within seconds of injection. Moving to the music stand, Holmes studied the handwritten score of Midnight's Embrace with growing interest. The musical notation was complex, filled with unusual markings and dynamic instructions that spoke of a composer pushing the boundaries of conventional performance. The victim's final composition, he mused, his finger tracing the intricate passages. Note these markings, Watson. Fortissimo sections requiring the full use of the sustaining pedal, building to a climactic passage that would demand complete physical and emotional commitment from the performer. Our killer knew this piece intimately, understood exactly when and how the fatal mechanism would be triggered. Holmes straightened, his gray eyes already showing that peculiar light that indicated the formation of a theory. The crime was engineered with theatrical precision, Watson. Every element, the dimmed lighting, the emotional intensity of the final piece, the positioning of the audience, was calculated to create the perfect conditions for an impossible murder. But who could have installed such a device? Lestrade interjected. The piano would need to be accessed privately by someone with both technical skill and opportunity. Precisely the question that shall guide our next inquiries, Inspector. I shall require a complete account of everyone who has had access to this instrument in recent days. Tuners, movers, perhaps even the composer himself during rehearsals. Our phantom pianist may have vanished from this room, but he has left us a symphony of evidence that shall ultimately lead to his identification. As Holmes carefully collected the physical evidence and made his final notations, I could sense the familiar stirring of his intellectual machinery engaging with a worthy opponent. The game was indeed afoot, and our adversary had revealed himself to be a criminal of uncommon sophistication and dramatic flair. The challenge now lay in following the threads of this carefully orchestrated deception back to their source, before the phantom pianist could strike again. Having completed his meticulous examination of the crime scene, Holmes straightened and turned his penetrating gaze toward the drawing room where the evening's witnesses waited in subdued clusters. The fog pressed against the tall windows like curious spectators, while gaslight cast wavering shadows that seemed to dance in rhythm with the nervous conversations within. "Inspector Lestrade," Holmes said, his voice carrying that particular tone of controlled anticipation that marked the beginning of his systematic approach to human testimony. "I believe we must now turn our attention to the living elements of this puzzle. The mechanical aspects of our phantom's method are clear enough, but the human motivations remain shrouded in theatrical misdirection." We entered the drawing room to find the guests arranged in a tableau of barely contained anxiety. Holmes surveyed the assembly with that peculiar intensity that marked his assessment of character, noting the subtle interplay of relationships and the telling details of deportment that spoke volumes about each individual's state of mind. Miss Vivian Ashford proved to be our most illuminating witness. A young woman of perhaps 25 years, she possessed that particular combination of artistic sensitivity and underlying strength that marked the serious musician. Her dark eyes showed clear evidence of recent tears, yet she maintained admirable composure as Holmes guided her to a quiet alcove for private conversation. "Miss Ashford, you mentioned earlier that Maestro Armitage had been receiving threatening communications. When did these begin, and what was their precise nature?" "About 6 weeks ago, Mr. Holmes. Anonymous letters, written in a disguised hand, warning him to cease his public performances." The language was quite dramatic. References to silencing the phantom and ending the musical charade. Lucien treated them as the ravings of an unbalanced mind, but they disturbed me greatly. Holmes leaned forward with increased interest. "You also spoke of mysterious private performances. Can you elaborate on these unusual engagements?" Miss Ashford glanced nervously around the room before lowering her voice. "For the past 2 months, Lucien had been receiving requests for private recitals, always anonymous, always accompanied by extraordinary payments. Gold sovereigns delivered by messenger, with instructions for performances at various locations around London. Empty houses in Belgravia, abandoned churches, even a disused warehouse near the Thames. The patron never revealed himself, never made direct contact." "And the most recent of these performances?" 3 nights ago, at a house in Eaton Square. Lucien returned quite agitated, saying he had felt watched throughout the entire recital. It was after that performance that he began to take the threatening letters seriously. Tonight, he had planned to make a public declaration, to name this mysterious patron and end these clandestine arrangements. Holmes's eyes sharpened at this revelation. As Miss Ashford returned to her companions, I noticed him observing a small dark stain on her left glove, barely perceptible, but clearly noted by his keen vision. Mr. Edmund Kestrel, when summoned, proved brisk and guarded. His sharp features betrayed the calculating mind of a theatrical impresario, though his obvious distress at losing his most profitable client seemed genuine enough. "The threatening letters, Mr. Kestrel. Were you aware of their contents?" Lucien showed me several. Dramatic nonsense, I thought, though the handwriting suggested education. Possibly foreign, German or Austrian characteristics in the script formation. Dr. Marcus Pemberton entered with the quiet assurance of his profession, though Holmes immediately noted a small brownish flake upon his cuff. "Shellac," Holmes observed aloud. "You employ it professionally?" "For instrument varnish," Pemberton replied steadily. "Sir Reginald consulted me about a violin's finish before tonight's performance. I'm both physician and collector." "You were observed near the piano's pedal assembly after this afternoon's rehearsal. I admire fine cabinetry. The Steinway's construction is exemplary." His voice remained calm, though I detected a slight tremor. "Prussic acid is not difficult to procure for one with medical standing, Mr. Holmes. But I did not murder Lucien Armitage." As the interviews concluded, Lestrade approached with his notebook filled with conventional observations. "The evidence points clearly toward Miss Ashford, Mr. Holmes. A woman scorned the threatening letters. Her emotional investment in the victim—" Holmes raised his hand with characteristic dismissiveness. "While Miss Ashford's distress and Mr. Kestrel's financial concerns provide convenient narrative threads, Inspector, they do not explain the exquisite mechanism of death, nor the theatrical nature of its execution. We are dealing with someone who has orchestrated not merely murder, but an elaborate campaign of psychological manipulation culminating in tonight's climax." His grey eyes took on that familiar light of intellectual engagement. "Ah, Phantom Pianist grows more substantial with each revelation, Watson. The private performances, the threatening letters, even the victim's final composition, all elements in a carefully constructed symphony of death. Tomorrow we shall trace these threads to their source, for I suspect our mysterious patron is far closer than any of us imagine." The fog swirled thicker outside the windows, as if nature itself conspired to shroud the secrets that lay hidden within the elegant walls of the Blackwood mansion. The grey November dawn found Holmes already at work in our sitting room, the gas lamp still burning against the persistent gloom as he bent over his chemical apparatus with characteristic intensity. The acrid smell of reagents mingled with tobacco smoke, creating an atmosphere of scientific inquiry that had become second nature to our domestic routine. I observed him methodically testing samples from the previous night's evidence, his movements precise despite having worked through the small hours. "The residue confirms prussic acid beyond question, Watson," he announced without lifting his eyes from the test tubes. "But observe this curious anomaly. Traces of a refined rosin compound mixed with the toxin. Our phantom demonstrates not merely chemical knowledge, but intimate familiarity with the materials of musical performance. The rosin suggests someone who works regularly with stringed instruments, perhaps a violin maker or restorer." He moved to examine the rose petal under his most powerful magnifying glass, applying minute quantities of various reagents to different sections of the crimson fragment. "Most illuminating," he murmured, making careful notations in his casebook. "The cellular structure indicates recent detachment from the parent plant, yet there were no roses present in the Blackwood music room. More significantly, I detect traces of barium sulfate, an unusual compound to find on a flower petal, typically associated with certain theatrical pigments and photographic processes." Before I could inquire about the significance of this discovery, Mrs. Hudson appeared with the Morning Post, including a thick envelope bearing Sir Reginald's crest. Holmes examined the contents with evident satisfaction, a comprehensive list of everyone who had accessed the Steinway piano in recent weeks, compiled by the meticulous butler according to Holmes's specifications. "Excellent," Holmes declared, scanning the detailed records. "Here we find our first concrete lead. Hawthorne and Bell, piano makers of Tottenham Court Road, serviced the instrument 2 days prior to the murder. Most significantly, their regular tuner was indisposed, and they sent a substitute, one Alfred Penrith, previously unknown to the household. Within the hour, we had taken a hansom through the awakening streets to the narrow establishment of Hawthorne and Bell, where the morning light filtered through windows displaying ranks of gleaming keyboard instruments. Mr. Hawthorne, a stooped gentleman whose fingers bore the permanent stains of his trade, received us amidst the familiar scents of beeswax and seasoned wood. "Mr. Penrith, you say?" Hawthorne's weathered features showed immediate concern. "Not one of our regular staff, I'm afraid. Our usual man, Vance, took ill quite suddenly, and Penrith came recommended by a colleague, competent enough in his work, though he seemed unusually interested in the piano's internal mechanisms. Spent considerable time examining the pedal assembly." Holmes leaned forward with increased attention. "Describe this substitute tuner, if you please." "A spare man of middle height, perhaps 35 years, with fair hair and a modest moustache. Spoke with a cultured voice, though there was something foreign in his pronunciation. Germanic, I would say. His hands showed the calluses of long practice, and I noticed a fresh cut on his right thumb, as if from a sharp tool. He paid in exact coin for certain materials he required." The address Hawthorne provided led us to a modest lodging house in Lambeth, where our inquiries met with frustrating but illuminating results. The landlady, a sharp-eyed woman with an evident talent for observation, informed us that Mr. Penrith had vacated his rooms that very morning, leaving his rent paid in advance and no forwarding address. "A quiet gentleman he was," she explained, leading us to the recently abandoned quarters. "Kept to himself, though I did notice the smell of varnish and chemicals about his person. Had only one visitor that I saw, a well-dressed gentleman in evening clothes who called 2 nights past. They spoke in low voices about musical matters, and I heard the name Armitage mentioned several times." Holmes's examination of the vacant room revealed telling details despite the tenant's hasty departure. From the cold fireplace grate, he extracted with his tweezers a partially burned fragment of crimson rose petal. and from beneath the washstand, a tiny brass screw bearing traces of the same rosin compound we had discovered on the murder weapon. "Our phantom grows more substantial, Watson," Holmes observed as we emerged into the grey morning air. Penrith was clearly our mechanical executioner, but the evidence suggests he was acting under direction rather than from personal motive. The cultured visitor, the precise timing of his employment and Hawthorne and Bell, the sophisticated nature of the device itself, all point to a mastermind of considerable resources and planning ability. As our hansom carried us back toward the West End, Holmes sat in contemplative silence, his keen eyes distant as he assembled the growing collection of evidence into a coherent pattern. The rose petals, the Germanic characteristics in the threatening letters, the mysterious private performances, each element seemed to point toward a complex web of deception that extended far, beyond a simple crime of passion. "The game grows more intricate, Watson," he said finally, his voice carrying that particular note of intellectual excitement that marked his engagement with a worthy adversary. "Our phantom pianist has orchestrated not merely a murder, but an elaborate campaign of psychological manipulation. The question now is whether we can trace the conductor of this deadly symphony before he strikes the final, fatal chord." The fog continued to swirl through London streets, but I sensed that Holmes had already begun to penetrate the murky depths of this most musical mystery, following threads of evidence that would ultimately lead us to the heart of a deception as ingenious as it was diabolical. Our investigation resumed that afternoon with Holmes's characteristic methodical precision, following the trail of evidence that pointed inexorably toward the mysterious private performances. The address in Eaton Square that Miss Ashford had mentioned proved to be a shuttered mansion whose elegant facade concealed secrets that would illuminate the darker aspects of our phantom's campaign. The caretaker, a grumbling fellow interrupted from his afternoon tea, admitted us to rooms that bore the unmistakable signs of recent clandestine activity. Holmes moved through the principal drawing room with that peculiar intensity that marked his engagement with a promising scene, his keen eyes cataloguing details that would escape ordinary observation. "Observe, Watson," he said, indicating two parallel furrows in the accumulated dust where a heavy object had been positioned near the room's center. The width corresponds precisely to a piano bench, not a chair. Here, too, chalk marks at regular intervals along the wainscoting, exactly 3 feet from the floor. Someone has been taking measurements, not of the room's dimensions, but of a seated performer's position. Moving to the tall windows, Holmes drew back the heavy curtains to reveal shutters bearing a small, perfectly circular aperture. Around this opening clung fragments of black velvet that had clearly been hastily removed. The detective's examination with his magnifying glass revealed traces of a peculiar residue around the hole's edges. "Most illuminating," he murmured, applying a small quantity of litmus paper to the residue. "The chemical signature is unmistakable. Acetic acid and sodium thiosulfate. Photographic chemicals, Watson. Our mysterious patron was not merely listening to these private performances, he was recording them through photographic means." Near the cold fireplace stood a makeshift table bearing the telltale stains of chemical processing. Holmes's systematic examination revealed fragments of coated paper and glass plate negatives, most deliberately destroyed but leaving enough evidence to confirm his hypothesis. Among the debris, his tweezers extracted a single rose petal, its edges showing the same distinctive bruising had observed at the Blackwood mansion. "The rose serves as his signature," Holmes observed, comparing the petal to our preserved evidence. "Left at each scene as a calling card, or perhaps a message meaningful only to the victim. The same narrow blade made these cuts, the same hand placed these tokens." Before we could complete our examination of the Eaton Square house, a Scotland Yard messenger arrived with urgent news that would cast our investigation in an entirely different light. Inspector Lestrade's hastily scrawled note informed us that Alfred Penrith, the substitute piano tuner, had been discovered dead in a small workshop near Waterloo Station, the circumstances suggesting murder rather than natural causes. The workshop proved to be a cramped space behind a cabinet-maker's yard, its windows shrouded in black cloth to create the darkness necessary for photographic work. The acrid tang of chemicals filled the air, and scattered about the room were the implements of both mechanical craftsmanship and photographic processing. Penrith himself sat propped against the wall in an attitude that immediately struck Holmes as artificially arranged. "Staged to suggest suicide," Holmes observed, examining the wine-glass beside the body without disturbing its position. "Yet observe the residue pattern inside the glass. 2 distinct rings indicating the liquid was poured once, left untouched, then filled again to the brim. Our victim never drank from this vessel." His systematic examination revealed the heel drag marks on the floorboards that indicated the body had been repositioned after death, and more significantly, traces of the same refined shellac we had discovered on Dr. Pemberton's cuff. Among the deliberately smashed photographic plates, Holmes managed to piece together fragments showing the unmistakable profile of Maestro Armitage at his keyboard. "The pattern becomes clear," Holmes announced as we emerged into the grey afternoon air. "Our phantom patron has been systematically documenting Armitage's performances through clandestine photography. Penrith served as both the mechanical executioner who installed the murder device and the photographer who recorded these private recitals. His death represents the elimination of a dangerous witness." The implications of this discovery cast our entire investigation in a new light. We were dealing not with a simple crime of passion or financial gain, but with a sophisticated campaign of surveillance and manipulation that had culminated in murder. The mysterious patron's true motives remained shrouded, but the evidence pointed towards someone with both extensive resources and intimate knowledge of photographic processes. "Consider the connections, Watson," Holmes continued as our hansom carried us back toward the West End. "The Germanic characteristics in both Penrith's speech and the threatening letters suggest a common origin. The barium sulfate on the rose, petals indicates access to photographic chemicals. Most significantly, the systematic documentation of Armitage's performances suggests our phantom was building towards some specific goal that required detailed records of the victim's musical interpretations." As the fog began to thicken with the approaching evening, Holmes's expression took on that familiar cast of intense concentration that indicated the formation of a comprehensive theory. "We are dealing with someone who has transformed surveillance into an art form, Watson. The private performances, the photographic documentation, even the theatrical nature of the final murder, all elements in a carefully orchestrated campaign whose ultimate purpose we have yet to divine." The discovery of Penrith's workshop had provided crucial evidence, but it had also raised the stakes considerably. Our phantom pianist had demonstrated a ruthless willingness to eliminate his own accomplices, suggesting that anyone who posed a threat to his elaborate scheme would face similar consequences. As we prepared for the next phase of our investigation, I could not shake the feeling that we were racing against time to prevent further tragedy in this most musical of mysteries. The game had indeed grown more dangerous, and Holmes's next moves would need to be calculated with the utmost precision if we were to unmask this phantom before he could strike again. The fragments of photographic plates that Holmes had salvaged from Penrith's workshop proved more illuminating than their shattered condition initially suggested. By candlelight in our sitting room, he arranged the pieces with the meticulous care of an archaeologist reconstructing ancient pottery, his magnifying glass revealing details that had survived the deliberate destruction. "Watson, observe this reflection in the polished surface of the piano's music stand," he said, indicating a ghostly silhouette preserved in one of the larger fragments. Our phantom was careless in his documentation. The curved metal surface has captured his image like a mirror, showing us a tall figure in evening dress, positioned behind what appears to be a camera mounted on an elevated tripod. Holmes moved to his chemical apparatus, applying various reagents to different sections of the photographic material. The emulsion characteristics confirm my suspicions about our adversary's expertise. This is not the work of an amateur dabbling in photography, but someone with advanced knowledge of the collodion process and silver halide chemistry. More significantly, the systematic nature of these documentation efforts suggests an academic mind, someone trained in methodical observation and analysis. He turned to examine once more the threatening letters we had collected, laying them out under the concentrated gaslight. The Germanic characteristics in the handwriting have been troubling me, Watson. Not merely the formation of certain letters, but the underlying musical notation habits that persist despite attempts at disguise. This particular method of constructing the letter M is distinctive of the Continental Conservatory system, specifically the Viennese School of Musical Education. Holmes paused, his grey eyes taking on that familiar intensity that marked a crucial deduction. Consider the psychological profile emerging from our evidence. We are dealing with someone who possesses advanced musical training, expertise in photographic chemistry, access to precision mechanical instruments, and a deep-seated obsession with documenting and analyzing Armitage's performances. This is not mere rivalry, Watson. This is the methodical work of someone seeking to dissect and capture the very essence of musical genius. The detective moved to his files, withdrawing a thick folder of newspaper clippings and musical reviews he had been compiling. I've been researching Armitage's early career, particularly his time at the Vienna Conservatory. There are references here to a composition scandal 15 years ago, accusations of plagiarism brought by a professor who was subsequently dismissed for erratic behavior. The professor's name was Wilhelm Brenner, a former pianist whose performing career was ended by a carriage accident that damaged his right hand. Holmes's finger traced a particular passage in a yellowed review. Professor Brenner had been experimenting with photographic documentation of musical performances, claiming it was the only objective method of analyzing artistic technique. His dismissal came after increasingly unstable accusations against several promising students, but particularly against Lucien Armitage, whose composition Midnight's Embrace launched his international career. The implications struck me with sudden clarity. The same composition he performed as his final piece at the Blackwood Mansion. Precisely, Watson. Our phantom pianist is no phantom at all, but Professor Wilhelm Brenner, driven by 15 years of festering resentment and wounded pride. He's been using his photographic expertise to build a case for his plagiarism claims while simultaneously planning his revenge. The private performances, the systematic documentation, even the choice of murder weapon. All elements in an elaborate scheme to reclaim what he believes was stolen from him. Holmes rose and reached for his coat with characteristic decisiveness. Brenner's injury to his right hand explains the weakness in the ring finger, evident in the threatening letters. His academic background accounts for the methodical nature of his surveillance and the sophisticated murder mechanism. Most significantly, his obsession with proving his claims has transformed him from a disappointed academic into a calculating killer. Before we could proceed further with our analysis, Mrs. Hudson appeared with a telegram that would cast our investigation into an entirely new light. Holmes read the message with growing concern, his features darkening as he absorbed its contents. Inspector Lestrade reports another development, Watson. Dr. Pemberton has failed to return to his lodgings, and his landlady discovered signs of hasty departure, clothing missing, papers burned in the grate, and traces of the same chemical compounds we found at Penrith's workshop. It appears our phantom has been eliminating his accomplices with systematic thoroughness. The detective crumpled the telegram with uncharacteristic agitation. Brenner is cleaning house, Watson, removing anyone who might connect him to the murders. We are no longer merely solving a crime. We are racing against time to prevent further tragedy. A man who has killed twice to protect his secret will not hesitate to eliminate anyone who threatens to expose his true identity. As Holmes gathered his investigative materials with urgent efficiency, I could sense that our case was approaching its most dangerous phase. Professor Wilhelm Brenner had finally acquired both name and motive, But the revelation had come at a cost. We were now dealing with a desperate academic turned killer, someone with nothing left to lose and the technical expertise to strike again before we could bring him to justice. The fog continued to swirl through London streets, but beneath its concealing shroud, a deadly game of cat and mouse was about to reach its climactic confrontation. The phantom pianist had been unmasked, yet the most perilous movement of this murderous symphony was still to come. The urgency of preventing further murders drove Holmes into immediate action, his analytical mind calculating the most efficient means of tracking our elusive professor. Within the hour, we found ourselves in the cramped premises of Ashford and Company, photographic suppliers near Chancery Lane, where the sharp scent of chemicals and the orderly rows of glass bottles spoke of the specialized trade that had enabled Brenner's elaborate surveillance campaign. Holmes's approach proved characteristically direct, his card and a sovereign loosening the memory of the elderly proprietor, whose stained fingers testified to years of handling the dangerous compounds of his profession. A foreign gentleman, professorial in bearing, the man recalled, consulting his ledger with evident nervousness. Purchased collodion, barium sulfate, and quantities of black velvet cloth over the past month. Most recently, he acquired a new plate holder and an expensive German lens. His right hand appeared stiff, paid entirely with his left, which struck me as peculiar for a man of obvious education. "The name he provided?" Holmes inquired, his grey eyes intent upon the shopkeeper's records. Professor Weiss, though he seemed uncomfortable when I addressed him by that title, requested delivery to a reading room off the Strand, but provided an alternative address. Catherine Street, above what appeared to be a defunct photographic studio. The Catherine Street address proved to have been hastily abandoned, its rooms bearing the telltale signs of rapid departure. Holmes's systematic examination of the premises revealed the same chemical residues we had discovered at previous locations, but more significantly, he extracted from the cold fireplace grate a partially burned document bearing Germanic script and musical notations. "Our phantom grows increasingly desperate, Watson," Holmes observed, studying the charred fragments with his magnifying glass. "This appears to be correspondence with someone at the Royal Academy of Music, inquiries about presenting evidence of plagiarism in Armitage's compositions. Brenner's academic pride demands public vindication, not merely private revenge. He seeks to destroy Armitage's reputation as thoroughly as he destroyed the man himself." Holmes straightened, his expression taking on that familiar cast of strategic calculation. "Consider the psychology of our adversary, Watson. 15 years of festering resentment have transformed a disappointed academic into a methodical killer, but the academic mindset persists beneath the criminal exterior. He cannot rest until his truth is acknowledged by his peers. This compulsion will be his undoing." Returning to Baker Street, Holmes immediately dispatched a series of carefully worded telegrams. The first, addressed to Sir Reginald Blackwood, requested the use of his music room for a private examination of recently discovered manuscripts relating to the late Maestro Armitage. The second, sent to several prominent music critics and Academy officials, announced the discovery of significant documentation regarding the authenticity of certain celebrated compositions. "We shall provide Professor Brenner with the very stage his ego demands," Holmes explained as he sealed the final message. "A gathering of musical authorities ostensibly convened to examine evidence that might vindicate his long-standing claims. He will be unable to resist such an opportunity, for his entire campaign has been directed toward this moment of academic triumph." Holmes spent the remaining daylight hours in meticulous preparation, transforming our sitting room into a workshop of detection. He carefully modified the spring mechanism from the piano's pedal assembly, replacing its deadly payload with a small glass ampule containing aniline dye. "A little color to mark our visitor when he attempts to employ his favored method once more," he explained with grim satisfaction. Miss Ashford arrived as the November dusk settled over London, her composure admirable despite the obvious strain of recent events. Holmes received her with uncharacteristic gentleness, recognizing both her genuine grief for her mentor and her courage in assisting our investigation. "You mentioned that Maestro Armitage intended to make a public declaration regarding his mysterious patron," Holmes said. "I believe Professor Brenner learned of this intention and accelerated his timeline accordingly. Tonight, we shall give him the opportunity he has sought, while ensuring he receives the justice he has evaded." As evening approached, we returned to the Blackwood mansion, where Sir Reginald had arranged the music room exactly as Holmes specified. The gas lamps were dimmed to match the conditions of the fatal recital, while Inspector Lestrade positioned his men behind the Chinese screen and in the adjoining corridors. Holmes himself took station near the shuttered window where Brenner had conducted his photographic surveillance, his keen senses alert for any sign of the professor's approach. "He will come," Holmes said with quiet confidence as the appointed hour drew near. "His academic pride and his need for vindication make attendance inevitable. 15 years of planning and preparation have led to this moment, and he will not allow it to pass without attempting to claim his perceived victory." The fog pressed close against the windows as Miss Ashford took her position at the piano, her fingers finding the opening measures of Midnight's Embrace with haunting precision. The familiar melody filled the room with its complex harmonies, creating an atmosphere both beautiful and sinister as we waited for our phantom pianist to make his final, fatal appearance. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine whether justice or academic obsession would prevail in this most musical of mysteries. In the gathering darkness beyond the shuttered windows, I could sense the approach of our adversary, drawn inexorably toward the trap that Holmes had so carefully prepared. The endgame had begun, and the phantom pianist was about to discover that his carefully orchestrated campaign of murder and deception was approaching its final, discordant note. The haunting melody of Midnight's Embrace filled the dimmed music room with ethereal beauty as Miss Ashford's skilled fingers navigated the complex passages that had marked Maestro Armitage's final performance. Each note seemed to carry spectral weight, as if summoning the very essence of the murdered pianist back to his beloved instrument. Holmes positioned himself near the shuttered window where we had discovered evidence of photographic surveillance, his keen senses alert for any sign of our phantom's approach. The assembled audience, carefully selected music critics and Royal Academy officials, listened with rapt attention, unaware that they were participating in an elaborate trap designed to draw out a calculating murderer. Inspector Lestrade's men remained concealed behind the Chinese screen and in adjacent corridors, their presence known only to Holmes and myself as we waited for Professor Wilhelm Brenner to make his inevitable appearance. As Miss Ashford approached the composition's first climactic passage, her foot pressed toward the sustaining pedal with practiced precision. Holmes had instructed her to apply only partial pressure until his signal, avoiding the full depression that would trigger our modified mechanism prematurely. The music swelled with emotional intensity, building toward the fortissimo section that would demand complete commitment from any serious performer. It was then that Holmes's sharp eyes detected the telltale signs of our quarry's presence. A faint scraping sound from beyond the garden windows, followed by the brief glint of a photographic lens being adjusted in the darkness beyond. But more significantly, a shadow detached itself from the servants' corridor, a tall figure in dark evening clothes, moving with the careful precision of someone intimately familiar with the room's layout. Professor Wilhelm Brenner had arrived, his gaunt frame draped in photographer's cloth like a medieval monk's cowl. His damaged right hand remained pressed close to his body, while his left moved with practiced efficiency toward the piano's pedal assembly. The academic obsession that had driven him to murder now compelled him to witness firsthand the effectiveness of his deadly mechanism. "Now, Miss Ashford," Holmes whispered, his hand rising in subtle signal. As her foot pressed the sustaining pedal to its full extent, the modified mechanism released its harmless payload with a soft metallic click. A fine jet of brilliant violet aniline dye erupted from the concealed apparatus, painting Brenner's glove, cuff, and the exposed portion of his cheek with an indelible mark that glowed like a brand in the gaslight. Brenner's startled exclamation, unmistakably German in its guttural consonants, shattered the musical atmosphere as he jerked away from the piano, striking his head against the keyboard's underside. The harsh discord of multiple keys seemed to echo the violent dissonance of his 15-year obsession, finally brought to light. "Stop this charade," he cried, throwing back his hood to reveal features marked by bitterness and intellectual arrogance. "You desecrate stolen music. That composition belongs to me. Every note, every phrase stolen by that charlatan Armitage." Holmes stepped forward with characteristic calm, though his grey eyes blazed with the satisfaction of a successful deduction. "Professor Wilhelm Brenner, your academic theatrics end here. The violet dye marks you as surely as your own signature rose petals marked your crimes." Brenner's response was swift and desperate. From his coat pocket, he produced a small paper cup and struck a match against the floor with practiced efficiency. The room exploded in searing white light as magnesium powder ignited, filling the air with metallic smoke and temporarily blinding everyone present. Holmes, anticipating such photographic trickery, had already pressed a dampened handkerchief to his face and launched himself toward the fleeing figure. The chase led through the mansion's corridors into the glass-vaulted conservatory, where November fog pressed against the panes like curious spirits witnessing the drama within. Brenner moved with surprising agility despite his injured hand, but the violet stain upon his face blazed like a beacon in the pale light filtering through the glass. "Stop, Professor," Holmes commanded, his voice carrying absolute authority. "Your campaign of murder and deception ends tonight." Brenner turned at bay, his cultured features twisted with academic fury and wounded pride. "You understand nothing, detective. 15 years I documented every performance, every nuance of interpretation. That music was mine, stolen by a talented student who built his entire career upon my genius." "Your genius, Professor, lay in mechanical ingenuity and photographic technique," Holmes replied, advancing carefully. "But murder is not scholarship, and revenge is not justice. Alfred Penrith died to protect your secret, as did Dr. Pemberton when he threatened to expose your chemical expertise." In desperation, Brenner reached for a small phial concealed in his waistcoat, undoubtedly containing the same prussic acid that had killed Armitage. Holmes's walking stick struck the man's wrist with surgical precision, sending the deadly vial spinning harmlessly across the conservatory tiles, where it shattered against a marble planter. Inspector Lestrade and his constables emerged from the shadows to secure the prisoner, though Brenner continued to struggle with the dignified desperation of a scholar whose life's work had been revealed as elaborate delusion. As the violet-stained professor was led away in custody, Holmes methodically presented the accumulated evidence to our assembled witnesses. The spring-loaded mechanism, carefully preserved from the piano's pedal assembly, demonstrated the mechanical precision of the murder method. Fragments of photographic plates, painstakingly reconstructed, showed Brenner's systematic documentation of Armitage's private performances. Most damning of all, the threatening letters bore handwriting characteristics that matched samples found in Brenner's abandoned workshop. "The rose petals served as his signature," Holmes explained, producing the crimson fragment in its glass envelope. "Left at each crime scene as a calling card of academic vindication. Professor Brenner transformed surveillance into obsession and obsession into murder, all in service of proving a plagiarism claim that existed only in his wounded imagination." Miss Ashford, who had maintained remarkable composure throughout the evening's drama, finally allowed her emotions to surface as the full horror of her mentor's death was laid bare. "He truly believed the music was his," she said quietly. 15 years of festering resentment had transformed disappointment into delusion, and delusion into deadly purpose. As the fog began to lift, with the approaching dawn, Holmes stood contemplating the conservatory where our phantom pianist had made his final appearance. The case had revealed the dark potential of academic obsession unchecked by moral restraint, showing how intellectual pride could corrupt even the most refined sensibilities. "A brilliant mind perverted by wounded vanity," Holmes observed as we prepared to depart the Blackwood mansion. Professor Brenner possessed the knowledge and skill to contribute meaningfully to musical scholarship, yet he chose instead to channel his abilities into an elaborate campaign of surveillance, manipulation, and ultimately murder. The phantom pianist has played his final note, Watson, and the discord of his obsession has been resolved into the harmony of justice served. The November morning revealed London in its familiar grey majesty, the fog retreating to expose a city where reason had once again triumphed over the darker impulses of human nature. The phantom pianist's deadly symphony had reached its conclusion, leaving behind only the echoes of a mystery solved through the methodical application of logical deduction and the unwavering pursuit of truth. As our hansom carried us back toward Baker Street, I reflected upon the intricate web of deception that Holmes had so masterfully unraveled, and the reminder that even in the refined world of classical music, the basest human motivations could orchestrate the most sophisticated crimes. The case of the phantom pianist's final note would take its place among our most memorable adventures, a testament to the power of analytical reasoning to illuminate even the darkest corners of criminal ingenuity. The violet-stained figure of Professor Wilhelm Brenner was led away through the November dawn, his academic dignity shattered beyond repair, yet his defiance still blazing in eyes that refused to acknowledge defeat. As Inspector Lestrade's constables secured the prisoner, the assembled music critics and Royal Academy officials dispersed into the fog-shrouded streets, their scholarly expectations transformed into whispered accounts of murder most ingenious. The elegant music room of the Blackwood mansion, which had witnessed both artistic triumph and deadly deception, now stood empty, save for the lingering echoes of justice served. Holmes spent the remainder of the morning at Scotland Yard, methodically presenting the accumulated evidence to Inspector Lestrade, with that characteristic precision that left no detail unexplored. The spring-loaded mechanism from the piano's pedal assembly, the fragments of photographic plates bearing Armitage's image, the threatening letters with their telltale Germanic characteristics. Each piece of evidence formed part of an inexorable chain of proof that bound our phantom pianist to his crimes. The beauty of the method lay in its mechanical inevitability, Holmes explained, demonstrating the deadly device's operation for the easy, assembled officials. Professor Brenner understood that any accomplished pianist performing an emotional climax would depress the sustaining pedal to its fullest extent. The device required no proximity to the victim, no moment of vulnerability, only the victim's own artistic commitment to trigger the fatal mechanism. Lestrade, whose initial bafflement had given way to professional admiration, shook his head in wonder. "And the photographic documentation served what purpose, Mr. Holmes?" "Academic validation," Holmes replied, his gray eyes reflecting both understanding and contempt for such twisted scholarship. Brenner's wounded pride demanded not merely revenge, but proof of his claims. He sought to build an irrefutable case for plagiarism through systematic documentation of Armitage's performances, never realizing that his methods had transformed him from aggrieved academic into calculating murderer. As our hansom carried us back through the awakening streets of London, I found myself compelled to understand the deeper currents that had driven Professor Brenner to such elaborate criminality. The fog was lifting in patches, revealing familiar architecture transformed by morning light, much as our investigation had gradually illuminated the dark corners of academic obsession. "Holmes," I ventured, breaking the contemplative silence that had settled between us. "How did 15 years of resentment culminate in such methodical violence? Surely there were opportunities for reconciliation, for academic discourse to resolve his grievances through proper channels." Holmes turned from his observation of the passing streetscape, his expression carrying that particular mixture of intellectual satisfaction and human sadness that marked our most complex cases. Consider the psychology of wounded pride, Watson. Professor Brenner's injury prevented him from pursuing his performing career, leaving only his compositions as testament to his musical abilities. When Armitage's success appeared to be built upon those very works, Brenner's entire identity as an artist was called into question. The detective paused, his long fingers drumming against the hansom's window frame as he organized his thoughts. The tragedy lies not in the original dispute, but in Brenner's inability to distinguish between collaboration and theft. His academic mind, trained in precise attribution and scholarly credit, could not accept that musical inspiration might flow between mentor and student in ways that transcend simple ownership. He transformed what might have been artistic partnership into a zero-sum battle for recognition. Holmes's systematic explanation of the deductive process that had led us to Professor Brenner demonstrated once again the power of methodical observation wedded to logical analysis. Each seemingly insignificant detail, the bitter almond scent that indicated localized rather than atmospheric poisoning, the rose, petals bearing traces of photographic chemicals, the Germanic characteristics in handwriting that attempted disguise, had contributed to an inevitable conclusion. The mechanical precision of the murder device pointed to someone with both engineering knowledge and intimate familiarity with piano construction. Holmes continued. The photographic documentation suggested academic methodology applied to criminal surveillance. When these elements were combined with the victim's history of plagiarism accusations involving a German professor whose performing career ended with hand injury, the identity of our phantom became clear. The detective's analysis revealed how Brenner's elaborate campaign had been both his strength and his ultimate weakness. The very thoroughness that marked his academic approach had left an abundance of evidence for the trained observer to follow. His need for documentation and validation had created the paper trail that led inexorably to his identification. As we arrived at Baker Street, Holmes paused on our familiar threshold to observe the morning light filtering through the November air. The fog had largely dissipated, leaving London revealed in its customary grey majesty, a city where reason and method could still triumph over the darker impulses of human nature. "The phantom pianist has played his final note, Watson," Holmes said quietly, his voice carrying both satisfaction and melancholy. Professor Brenner possessed genuine musical knowledge and mechanical ingenuity that might have contributed meaningfully to artistic scholarship. Instead, he chose to channel those abilities into an elaborate symphony of surveillance, manipulation, and murder. Miss Vivian Ashford called upon us that afternoon, her mourning attire unable to diminish the quiet strength that had enabled her to assist our investigation despite her personal grief. She brought with her the final manuscript of Midnight's Embrace, its complex notations now serving as both artistic legacy and criminal evidence. Maestro Armitage often spoke of the collaborative nature of musical creation, she said, her voice steady despite the emotion underlying her words. He believed that great art emerged from the interplay of influences, the building upon previous works to create something new and meaningful. Professor Brenner's tragedy was his inability to see collaboration as enhancement rather than theft. As evening settled over Baker Street, Holmes took up his violin and drew from it a simple, melancholy phrase that seemed to capture both the beauty and the sorrow of our recently concluded case. The notes hung in the air like a benediction for the lost possibilities that had been destroyed by pride and misunderstanding. "There are crimes of passion, Watson, and crimes of calculation," he observed, lowering his instrument with characteristic deliberation. Professor Brenner's offenses combined both elements. 15 years of passionate resentment channeled through the cold methodology of academic planning. He created a masterpiece of criminal engineering, yet failed to recognize that his greatest composition was ultimately a symphony of self-destruction. The phantom pianist's deadly performance had reached its conclusion, leaving behind only the echoes of a mystery solved through the methodical application of logical deduction. In the gathering darkness beyond our windows, London continued its eternal dance of shadow and gaslight, secure in the knowledge that reason and justice could still illuminate even the most ingenious criminal deceptions. The case of the phantom pianist's final note would take its place among our most memorable adventures, a reminder that even in the refined world of classical music, the basest human motivations could orchestrate the most sophisticated crimes, yet could never ultimately escape the inexorable harmony of truth revealed through careful observation and logical analysis. As Holmes returned his violin to its case and reached for his evening pipe, I reflected upon the complex web of deception we had unraveled, and the sobering reminder that genius, when corrupted by wounded pride and unchecked obsession, could compose the most tragic of all possible symphonies. The phantom had vanished, but the music of justice would linger long after the final note had faded into silence. The grey December morning found Holmes in our familiar sitting room, methodically arranging the accumulated evidence of our phantom pianist case across the mahogany table like a conductor preparing his score. The mechanical device, the photographic fragments, the threatening letters, and the telltale rose petals lay before us in ordered precision, each piece contributing to the symphony of deduction that had brought Professor Wilhelm Brenner to justice. "You observe, Watson," Holmes began, drawing thoughtfully upon his pipe, "that this case presented us with two distinct orchestras playing in counterpoint, the mechanical and the psychological. The device beneath the sustaining pedal explained itself once we accepted a murderer of extraordinary patience and engineering skill. The human element, motive, obsession, wounded pride, proved the more complex melody, yet ultimately the more decisive." He enumerated the crucial evidence with characteristic precision. The rose petal bearing traces of barium sulfate had immediately suggested photographic involvement rather than mere romantic symbolism. The localized scent of prussic acid indicated targeted delivery rather than atmospheric poisoning. The Germanic characteristics in the threatening letters, particularly the formation of capitals and the hard angles, pointed toward continental musical education. Most significantly, the shellac residue found on various surfaces connected our phantom to the specialized world of instrument craftsmanship and restoration. The photographic documentation was the key that unlocked Brenner's true methodology, Holmes continued, holding up one of the reconstructed plate fragments. He was not merely planning murder, Watson. He was building an academic case, documenting every nuance of Armitage's performances to support his plagiarism claims. The private recitals, the systematic photography, even the choice of murder weapon during a public performance, all elements in an elaborate campaign to destroy both the man and his reputation. Holmes's subsequent investigation had revealed the full extent of Brenner's ruthless elimination of witnesses. Dr. Pemberton, whose medical access to prussic acid had made him valuable to the professor's scheme, had grown increasingly uncomfortable with his role after the Blackwood rehearsals. His attempt to withdraw from the conspiracy had sealed his fate. Lestrade's examination of his lodgings revealed the same needle puncture behind the ear that had killed Armitage, though staged to appear an accidental poisoning during chemical experiments. Pemberton was a weak man rather than a wicked one, Holmes observed with characteristic insight into human nature. His collector's knowledge of instrument varnishes and his physician's access to dangerous compounds made him useful to Brenner's purposes. When conscience finally overcame fear, he became a liability to be eliminated with the same cold efficiency that marked all of Brenner's actions. Alfred Penrith's death had followed the same pattern, a skilled craftsman whose mechanical abilities had enabled the creation of the piano's deadly mechanism, eliminated once his usefulness expired, and his knowledge became dangerous to the professor's concealment. The subsequent legal proceedings revealed the full scope of Brenner's 15-year campaign of surveillance and manipulation. His academic credentials had provided access to the chemicals and technical knowledge necessary for both the photographic documentation and the mechanical murder device. More disturbing still was the discovery of similar surveillance equipment in his various lodgings, suggesting that other musicians had been targeted for his obsessive attention. Miss Ashford, whose courage and musical insight had proved invaluable to our investigation, visited us several days after Brenner's sentencing to transportation. She brought with her the complete manuscript of Midnight's Embrace, its complex notations now serving as both artistic legacy and evidence of the tragic obsession that had culminated in murder. Maestro Armitage often spoke of the responsibility that comes with artistic success, she said, her voice steady despite the obvious emotion underlying her words. He believed that great art built upon the foundations laid by previous generations, that creativity was a collaborative enterprise spanning centuries of musical development. Professor Brenner's tragedy was his inability to distinguish between influence and theft, between artistic evolution and personal plagiarism. Holmes received this observation with that particular attention he reserved for insights that illuminated the deeper currents of human nature. Miss Ashford speaks to the heart of our phantom's delusion, Watson. Brenner possessed genuine musical knowledge and mechanical ingenuity that might have contributed meaningfully to artistic scholarship. Instead, he chose to channel those abilities into an elaborate symphony of surveillance, manipulation, and ultimately murder. The detective moved to his violin, drawing from it a simple, melancholy phrase that seemed to capture both the beauty and the sorrow of our concluded case. There are crimes of passion, Watson, and crimes of calculation. Professor Brenner's offenses combined both elements, 15 years of passionate resentment channeled through the cold methodology of academic planning. He created a masterpiece of criminal engineering, yet failed to recognize that his greatest composition was ultimately a symphony of self-destruction. As the winter afternoon settled over Baker Street, Holmes returned his instrument to its case with characteristic deliberation. The phantom pianist's deadly performance had reached its conclusion, leaving behind only the echoes of a mystery solved through methodical observation and logical analysis. The world will remember this as the case of the impossible murder, Watson, a crime committed in full view of 30 witnesses, yet by no visible hand. But for those who understand the deeper currents of human nature, it serves as a reminder that genius, when corrupted by wounded pride and unchecked obsession, can compose the most tragic of all possible symphonies. Miss Ashford's determination to continue her musical career, despite the trauma of recent events, spoke to the resilience of artistic spirit over the destructive forces of jealousy and revenge. The spring season would bring new recitals, new interpretations of the classical repertoire, and the continuation of that endless dialogue between past and present that marks all genuine artistic endeavor. As evening approached and the familiar sounds of London settled into their nightly rhythm beyond our windows, Holmes took up his evening pipe with evident satisfaction. The case had challenged his deductive abilities while revealing the complex interplay of technical expertise and psychological obsession that could transform an academic mind into a calculating killer. The phantom pianist has played his final note, Watson, he said quietly, his grey eyes reflecting both the satisfaction of justice served and the melancholy recognition of human potential corrupted by circumstance. Professor Brenner possessed the knowledge and skill to contribute meaningfully to musical scholarship, yet chose instead to channel those abilities into an elaborate campaign of surveillance and murder. The tragedy lies not merely in the crimes committed, but in the artistic contributions that will never be made. The fog had begun to gather once more in the streets below, but within our familiar sitting room, the warmth of gaslight and the companionship of shared adventure created an atmosphere of contentment and anticipation. Somewhere in London's vast expanse, new mysteries awaited discovery, new phantoms demanded unmasking, and the eternal dance between criminal ingenuity and detective brilliance would continue its fascinating performance. Holmes reached for the evening paper with characteristic interest, his keen eyes already scanning the columns for hints of future investigations. The case of the phantom pianist's final note would take its place among our most memorable adventures, a testament to the power of methodical reasoning to illuminate even the most ingenious criminal deceptions, and a reminder that the greatest mysteries often lie not in the mechanics of crime, but in the complex harmonies and discordant notes of human nature itself. The phantom had vanished, but the music of mystery played on, as eternal and compelling as the city that sheltered both criminal genius and the detective brilliance that inevitably brought it to light. In the gathering darkness of our Baker Street lodgings, the great detective and his chronicler sat in comfortable silence, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new puzzles, and new opportunities to demonstrate that reason and method could still triumph over the darkest orchestrations of the human heart.